the country became very exposed and it became very challenging that governments are now talking about local production. Then we have a where you always have preference work on if you need to secure the chain for the future. And who heads the agencies that are involved in this kind of, they are appointed by governments, and what is the capacity? Previous speakers have spoken about stuff and others. So governments will have to now set up and see what regulatory, what policy
Okay, we can hear you. Hello? I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
Supply chain solutions have been made, but the public, hear me now. You hear me now?
Okay, we can.
Are you okay? Do you hear me now?
We do.
Yeah.
You might want to switch off the video. Okay.
So sorry about that. So you see that the bureaucratic system, private sector has to deal with a huge government bureaucratic system. And again, the issues of capital and interest rates, taxation, and they themselves not being involved in the decision-making process that affects the private sector in the supply chain. It's also a challenge that we need to deal with. Then the regulatory authorities themselves. Generally, in Africa is one of the places that we have huge delays in granting of marketing authorization, whether from local sources or from international sources, and this has to be worked on. It depends on the capacity and also the procedures and processes that have been put in place, because some of the procedures are very unclear and cumbersome, and it becomes very difficult for the private sector and others to comply. Sometimes there is over-regulation, sometimes there's under-regulation. So we need to work on this. And I'm happy that some regulatory authorities are now at maturity level 3, and this must impact on other regulatory authorities in the region. There is one thing that I have coined, that we are talking about harmonization of medicines regulatory systems on the continent. And this has started from the AU level through the African medicines regulatory harmonization to the various regional economic communities and so on. But we still find fragmentation in this harmonization. What I mean by this is that even when products have been assessed at regional level, you realize that you go to individual countries, then you are made to go through another process altogether. And maybe it is because the regulatory authorities are now more of income generating agencies than regulatory agencies, and therefore they need the money because governments are not funding them properly. And this is something that we need to work on if you need to secure the supply chain. Slide 2, please. And we end with that one. So then when the marketing authorization has been granted, you get into the procurement issues. And believe me, there's a lot of leakage in our procurement systems. And sometimes you find even products that have been procured purely for government and not for sale on the open market for sale. And this is something that we need to look at. There is also the unstructured distribution chain. Where does it begin and where does it end? Who are the intermediaries? These all have to be defined and backed by technology so that products can be tracked to the end user, and we do not find the situations of counterfeits and indiscriminate use of medicines. Storage and other facilities in whether it's the state medical stores or it's in private pharmacies and private hospitals, but there is inappropriate infrastructure. I mean, several reports have indicated that infrastructure available, particularly even cold storage for products that have to be stored under particular temperature ranges, are virtually unavailable. And if they are available, there's no power to support this kind of the inconsistencies in the supply of power, which is very also critical. And procedures may not be adhered to. In private pharmacies, in hospitals, again, human resource, people who supply the medicines, pharmacists, technicians, doctors, have a lot of information, but the patients do not have that information. How do we interface between this information asymmetry and make sure that people get what they need? Again, private pharmacies are virtually not considered as even part of the health system in many countries. And this is very challenging. And when it came to vaccination, you know, private pharmacies had to sort of go through a lot of challenges and even wanting to help. And governments were sort of preventing. And this is evident in many countries now that governments are trying to accept these. Enforcement of good storage and good distribution practices in pharmacies and in hospitals. And one major thing that is also bothering in this supply chain is polypharmacy, getting patients more than they require. How do we strategize? How do we treat our standard treatment guidelines and preferential lists for medicines? And I think the representative of the governor talked about products that are frequently used and needed in the state, which they store and make sure they are available. So if you take all these things into consideration, then we will need to improve on the whole governance structure, improve on appointments, improve on our systems, improve on our regulatory authorities, and make them less of income generating agencies than regulators, and make sure that products are available. Thank you very much, Egwe.
Okay, thank you very much, pharmacist Botwe. I mean, we started 5 minutes late and now we're 5 minutes beyond 10:35. So we're going to have to round off very quickly, but thank you. I think that was a very interesting perspective on sort of regulatory issues and the fact that the regulatory, if you're talking about increased manufacturing, more sophisticated products, what does that mean for regulatory agencies and how are regulatory agencies funded? I mean, many regulatory agencies, I mean, the cost of registering drugs in many African countries is sometimes more expensive than registering drugs in other countries, you know, and I know that it takes months, you know, to register drugs. And so you're right, as we're getting ready, we have 400 manufacturers. When we have 4,000, what's going to happen? So with that, so thank you so much. I'm going to add Dr. Mustafa to have the final words before we end the conversation. I believe we've answered most of the questions raised, and there's been a lot of interesting conversations in the chats about capacity and patient experience. And so thank you so much. Dr. Mustafa, you have...
Thank you. Let's keep it short. So thank you. The key messages I want to leave first, like we spoke about technology, but just remember always technology is a double-edged sword. I've worked on governance assessment in so many countries, and lots of governments and a lot of people think that by automation, we will mitigate the risks. No, automation might create other risks. So key message, digital transformation should go hand in hand with governance transformations. Otherwise, they might create different types of risks also. The second word I would like to leave it at the end is the words cost of capital and expected return. The higher the governance risk, it will always be a higher cost of capital and higher expected return and lower exit time. And this will be transferred to the government if it's a public-private partnership, or to the consumer. So if we don't tackle these risks, it will always become more expensive for us, and it's cheaper to tackle the risks than pay for this high cost of capital. The third key message I would like to leave these three words with you regarding any decision maker actor within this. We should always remember that these actors should be entrusted, empowered, and accountable. Entrusted through clear definition of roles and responsibilities assigned to the right people and entities with clear targeted outcomes. If we don't have this, then we cannot hold accountable. Empowered through capacities, as everyone said, through authorities, because sometimes we create the positions and the entities without the enforcement power or the acting power, and through information. If we don't have this thing, and then finally, we hold them accountable for something, for achieving the targeted outcomes through a mechanism and to a certain body. If we always think that we will have entrusted, empowered, accountable, we will have a system with a lower risk that will have a lower cost of capital. And this is the formula for success. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mustafa. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm sorry we had started a few minutes late and we're now 8 minutes beyond sort of at 10:35. But I think this has been an interesting conversation, and given what the conversations in the chat, I think there has been very good, interesting conversations. Mr. Mustafa Mokdeng from Kampala, Uganda, I think I'm going to paraphrase as a way to end, leadership is a major pillar of governance. And he says, we have a common African saying that fish rots from the head. So really, leadership at all levels, I think, as we've talked about, it's really important. Thank you so much for everybody for joining us this afternoon or morning, wherever you are. Thank you. We really appreciate your engagement. And I would like to thank all the wonderful speakers from the SSG, Dr. Ekuram, who joined us, Mr. Olaf Schmidt, Dr. Jim Rice, Dr. Hunter, Dr. Chiwala, pharmacist Botway, pharmacist Ofori, and for all of you that have spent time joining us and on the conversation, I would like to say thank you very much. We'll be sharing the presentations of all the speakers, and we'll be sending you a short summary of the conversation so far. So thank you so much, and I hope you'll join us for our next conversation on governance. Thank you.
Thank you.